Hello, and welcome back to the Vibrant Soulful Wellness Podcast. This is your space for simple ideas, practical strategies, and meaningful practices to support more vibrant, soulful living at work and in life. I'm your host, Annie Barrett. For over 20 years, I've guided individuals, groups, and workplaces toward greater well being and fulfillment, drawing on coaching, lifestyle medicine, habit change science, mindfulness, Ayurveda, and yoga. Each of these episodes offers grounded, accessible reflections and tools that you can actually use without adding more to your already full life. And I'm really glad you're here. I am back in Olympia, Washington for this episode. I was in Peru for the month of March, and I'm back now, and it's spring. I'm recording this on March 30th. So it is spring, things are leafing out. And part of the time that I was in Peru was working on a book that I'm excited to keep working on and hopefully get out this year. It's a book for women of my age. I'm 55. Maybe it's for you. You're maybe a little younger, a little older than me. But the book is envisioning midlife for women as an initiation into deeper vitality, wiser purpose, and self-authored living. So I was excited to get that project going while I was there. And, the last couple podcast episodes were also from Peru, where I have been talking about the four aims of life, this framework for living that comes from the yoga tradition. One of the first aims is thinking about purpose. The second aim, thinking about the means for supporting life, which in many ways is our vitality. We talked about that in our last podcast episode. And in this episode, I want to talk about the third of the four aims of life, which is kama. Kama stands for pleasure, enjoyment, delight, and the full experience of our senses. And it's a reminder that life is meant to be lived, not just managed. And the joy matters in midlife. So pleasure, our creativity, our relationships, our beauty. So joy matters in midlife, and we can, and indeed we must, balance responsibility with enjoyment. In Western culture, often we treat pleasure as indulgent or as optional. I'll get to it later when I retire, next year when I go on vacation. But the yoga tradition that I have studied and practiced for decades says something quite different. It says that pleasure is actually one of the aims of life. And it's a reminder, as I said before, that life is meant to be lived, not just managed. So what might this look like? It might look like time in nature. It might look like making time for our meaningful friendships, for music, for art, for a hobby we enjoy, for delicious food, for laughter, for intimacy, and simply pausing to appreciate something beautiful. And I believe that there's a deeper psychological wisdom here, which dates back to how we have evolved as humans, that as humans, we naturally carry a negativity bias. It might feel like something we're holding on our shoulders, something heavy. And we tend to focus on problems, right? And threats. And certainly I am saying this fully recognizing that we are living in a time where there are wars going on. And indeed, we must be proactive citizens. We must be responsible citizens. We must recognize that there are things going on in the world that are challenging and hard and terrible. And we have, of course, work to do around those. And it's also true that we must intentionally make space for joy and pleasure, that helps restore balance. And so both can be true. And by the time we get to midlife, many women realize that we have spent decades caring for others. Kama is a reminder that our own joy matters too. So in the past week or so, last week I took some time off and took some time for spring break and frankly some other projects that I needed to tend to in my time in Peru. But most recently, I have been inviting my yoga clients to play with this idea of kama and to find pleasure and enjoyment via the practice of yoga in our bodies. So in yoga, we were practicing activating our potential for experiencing pleasure, reminding ourselves to be in the moment, because while we can have memories of pleasant things that have happened in the past, and we can also anticipate pleasure in the future. Truly being in the moment is where we experience pleasure, that we can open up and activate our potential for the big and small moments of delight that life presents to us. And so if you've spent decades caring for and serving for others, this podcast, I hope, is a reminder to you to make time for your own joy, to consider what enjoyment is for you. And for me, my time in Peru, I had a little bit less of my responsibilities that I have in Olympia, and I contemplated what it is that I enjoy doing. And I feel like, remembering what we enjoyed when we were a kid is one of the ways into karma. When you were a kid, you probably lived a little bit more in the present moment than you do now. You were doing things for the sake of pleasure, not just your to-do list. So I invite you to think about what you enjoyed doing as a kid. Maybe it was playing, maybe it was moving your body, maybe you enjoyed art or a particular sport, maybe you liked building things. Certainly there was probably time with friends, eating things that were delicious like ice cream. I feel like as we get older, we often lose touch with the child in us who loved to play. And instead, the part of us that keeps to-do lists, manages affairs, and is concerned with productivity starts to take over. So this podcast episode is an invitation to get in touch with pleasure and delight. And a visit back to your childhood is one way to do that. So I invite you to think about, what is it that you loved doing as a child? What gave you delight? And I spent some time thinking about that while I was in Peru. When I was a child, I would spend hours drawing, painting, cutting, pasting, anything that involved paper and art materials. That was an invitation to pleasure for me. It was an invitation to really be in my sense of color and texture and delight. And it actually art was a primary source of pleasure until I got to middle school, to junior high. And I remember it distinctly. I was really excited to take an actual art class, but when I got there, it wasn't what I thought it would be. The teacher was old. He was kind of crotchety. He had a big agenda. And the projects that he invited us to do were exacting. They were not an invitation to creativity. And I'm not to say that art techniques aren't important, but in particular, I remember being so excited and then really being stifled in that class, that the projects that he invited us to do were exacting. They had to turn out a certain way. Gone was the free play and exploration that I had experienced doing art for myself. So it wasn't fun. And after one semester of art, I left art completely. I left art for decades. So I'm 55 now, and I am discovering art again. It has taken me the better part of a year to coax the girl who loved art and experienced art as a means of delight. It has taken the better part of a year to coax her back into my life. So first I bought art supplies, and actually they sat for months on a shelf, and finally I took them out and I gingerly started trying them. And one of my ways back into it was buying this very little book that really, like, the pages are like 3 inches by 3 inches. So it's very small. And I realized that I could just take the time to explore art in a very small way and make it playful and non-performative, because by the time we're in midlife, oftentimes we think that we do things to serve others or to perform in a certain way. And I really wanted my experience of art to be like what I was like when I was a girl. Playful, non-performative, that it didn't matter how it turned out. It was only for me, and that I wanted to simply enjoy art for art's sake. And so for this past month while I was in Peru, almost every day, I took a little bit of time to do a small, teeny tiny art project. And it was just for me. And I realized that this childlike part of me is still in here. I've been coaxing her out, and she has been delighted. The childlike part of me has been delighted with this little watercolor set and this little 3x3 watercolor journal. I found that the pages were small enough not to overwhelm me, and I could sit and paint one or a couple pages each day and just be in touch with my inner artist. It's fun, delightful. It's something I'm going to keep up here in Olympia. And I find that with a little bit of art in my life, I look at the world differently. Colors are more alive, flowers, trees, the things that I'm noticing. The world has become a delight for for my senses, an invitation to be more playful. That's one of the ways in which I've been engaging with my inner child. And I wonder, did you have something like art in your life? Something creative, whatever it might have been, music, art, building something, making something, something that you haven't done for decades? Maybe this spring is an invitation for you to coax that playful person out of you. So I'll share one other. The other childlike activity I have returned to is swimming. Here's my swimsuit. I bought a new swimsuit. I learned to swim at a young age, and I found that the water, the delight of being in the water and moving my body in water was so wonderful. I spent years swimming on a recreational swim team. Later on, I swam in high school, but really being in water, moving in water has always felt like freedom to me. Gliding, dipping, diving, moving, it delights my body. And since high school, I have swum very intermittently, sometimes on vacation here and there. Every once in a while, I would get out my swimsuit and goggles and go for a swim. But because swimming takes time, you have to get to the pool, change your clothes, do your workout, shower, get back. I found that during my years of parenting, it just didn't feel like a very efficient form of exercise. So I just left it. And it was decades really until I started swimming on a regular basis. And a year and a half ago, I started swimming again. Why? Because frankly, my time is a little bit more my own now. Yes, I still have people that I serve and take care of, but I found that I had a little bit more time to put swimming back in my life. So I bought a membership at my local pool. And over the past year and a half, I've been swimming 2 or 3 times a week. My body feels stronger. But more than that, I feel connected to the child in me who really loves water. And that has been such a source of freedom and of delight. And so these are my 2 examples. And I invite you to think about how and when you have been experiencing pleasure, maybe in nature, time with friends, enjoying art, good food, intimacy, creativity. And is there something that you enjoyed from your childhood that you'd like to get back to, that you always knew was a source of delight, always a source of fun, of enjoyment? Because that's what karma is. And if you've spent decades caring and serving for others, maybe this is a time for you to make your own joy. And I invite you to consider karma as a practice to consider enjoyment and delight through your bodies, through your senses, in the here and now. And so every week I like to offer you an inquiry. My inquiry for this week is, where in my life am I making space for enjoyment and delight? Where in my life am I making space for enjoyment and delight? And to consider that maybe you're at a time in your life when joy and the kind of aliveness that comes with joy deserves more space. So I invite you to consider this word karma, pleasure, enjoyment, opening up the senses, delight, art, and in some way, make a little pocket of time for you to pursue that this week. And that is it for today. Thank you for listening to the Vibrant Soulful Wellness Podcast. If you've enjoyed this episode, I invite you to subscribe wherever you listen. This podcast is on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon Music, and YouTube Music. And if you'd like to stay connected, visit vibrantsoulful.com, where you can join my weekly newsletter. You can find links to these episodes and also my blog posts, and you can explore many additional resources that I hope will support your well-being. Thank you for being here. Have a vibrant, soulful week, and I'll see you next time.